Former U.S. President Donald Trump has once again placed European leadership in his crosshairs, calling them weak and overly politically correct. In a December 2025 interview, Trump accused Europe's leaders of failing to address migration and the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, painting them as all talk and no action. He described Europe as a collection of decaying nations, intentionally provoking a contrast with his own America First approach. The timing is key. These remarks coincide with a new U.S. national security doctrine that formalizes skepticism toward traditional alliances. Trump's critique centers on migration and the Ukraine conflict, aligning with far-right European parties and expressing frustration at Europe's inability to resolve the war. By calling European leaders weak, Trump signals to his base that he's prioritizing American interests and warning Europe that unconditional U.S. support is over. This rhetoric forces European nations to reconsider their strategic positions both with the U.S. and globally. The message is clear. The era of quiet dependence on American leadership is ending. Europe now faces a moment of reckoning, compelled to adapt to a new, uncertain reality. Trump's harsh words are backed by a formal policy shift in the new U.S. national security strategy, released December 2025. The document marks a break from alliance-focused strategies, prioritizing unilateral American interests and casting doubt on the reliability of old allies. Europe is singled out as fundamentally unreliable, facing civilizational erasure due to failed migration policies and loss of identity. The strategy echoes far-right European rhetoric, even praising the rise of anti-immigration parties as a needed course correction. This open endorsement of populist leaders like Hungary's Viktor Orbán breaks diplomatic norms and signals a preference for nationalist partners. The U.S. is moving away from the post-WWT liberal order, charting a more confrontational, less multilateral course. For Europe, this is a clear signal. The foundations of the transatlantic alliance are now in question. European leaders have responded to Trump's criticism with public defiance but private pragmatism. European Council President Antonio Costa rebuked Trump's interference, insisting allies respect each other's democratic choices. Yet, behind the scenes, leaders in Berlin and Paris avoid public spats, focusing instead on adapting to shifting U.S. policy. The Russia-Ukraine war is a key test. Europe remains committed to supporting Ukraine and opposes any peace deal that cedes territory to Russia, even as Trump pushes for a quick settlement. Europe's response is a balancing act, projecting strength publicly while quietly preparing for a future with a less reliable U.S. partner. The realization is setting in. Europe must move beyond words and take concrete steps towards strategic autonomy. The era of dependence on the American security umbrella is ending. European leaders are beginning to adapt, investing in their own security. The transatlantic relationship is fundamentally changing, regardless of who is in the White House. Europe is being forced to stand on its own. Experts urge Europe to look past Trump's inflammatory language and focus on the underlying strategic message. Rachel Tazlin of the German Council on Foreign Relations notes that Trump's approach is a louder version of a long-standing U.S. demand. Europe must take more responsibility for its own security. The real message is that the U.S. no longer wants to be the world's policeman, especially as it pivots to China and domestic priorities. Trump's rhetoric about civilizational erasure mirrors far-right and Russian disinformation, aiming to divide Western societies. By echoing these narratives, the U.S. administration is straining relations with mainstream European allies. The expert consensus: Europe must separate the signal from the noise. The signal is clear. America expects a stronger, more self-reliant Europe, regardless of who is president. Europe's best response is to invest in defense, coordinate foreign policy, and build the capacity to act independently. This friction may ultimately catalyze a more balanced transatlantic partnership. For decades, Europe relied on the U.S. security umbrella, keeping defense spending low. Trump's criticism and the Ukraine war have turned this complacency into a crisis. European nations are now pledging to boost defense spending, with many aiming for over 3% of GDP, and additional funds for joint initiatives and Ukraine. There's a new focus on joint procurement, interoperability, and investment in cyber, drones, and AI, building a more integrated, independent defense base. The European Defense Fund is being strengthened to ensure real, deployable capabilities. Challenges remain decades of underinvestment and the difficulty of forging consensus among 27 states, but the direction is clear. Europe is moving toward credible military self-sufficiency. The continent is undergoing a historic transformation, becoming a security actor in its own right. Trump's claim that Europe is weak oversimplifies a complex transformation. Europe's internal divisions and reliance on the US have been real vulnerabilities, exposed by the Ukraine war and energy dependencies, but the continent is evolving, not decaying. The crises have forced Europe to become more unified and resilient, as seen in its robust response to Russia, absorbing refugees, sanctioning Moscow, and supporting Kyiv. Europe's strength is slow and collective, not flashy or unilateral. Beyond military power, the EU is a regulatory superpower, shaping global standards in technology, privacy, and climate policy. Its influence is less visible but critical in the 21st century. Europe's emphasis on diplomacy and consensus is often mistaken for weakness, but it's a sustainable approach to global leadership. The continent is forging a new identity as a more assertive geopolitical actor. This messy transition is a sign of adaptation, not decline. The Ukraine war has exposed deep differences between the US and Europe on security and conflict resolution. Trump's America-first approach favors quick deals, even at Ukraine's expense, while Europe insists on a just peace that restores Ukraine's sovereignty. This divergence could create a major rift if the US pushes for a settlement Europe finds unacceptable. European leaders face a tough choice: align with the US or defend their own security interests and values. Adversaries like Russia seek to exploit these divisions. Regardless of who is president, the US will continue to expect Europe to shoulder more responsibility. The current friction is forcing Europe to build the strategic autonomy it has long discussed. The future of transatlantic cooperation will depend on forging a partnership of equals, committed to shared democratic values despite their differences.